Testing. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me over there? Excellent, excellent. Thank you, guys. Okay, so once again, welcome. We, the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus, have very important work to do in our community. We have more than 400 active volunteers who have the knowledge, information, energy, and courage to do the work of engaging voters and safeguarding democracy. However, in order to increase our effectiveness, we would really like to grow in size and impact. To do so, we need your support. Please take note in the program information about how to become a sustaining League member. We would love to have you help us even more in our work to engage voters and safeguard democracy. Also, please note in your program book our statements about nonpartisanship and our statement about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'd like to read you our nonpartisan statement. This is a tradition. We always mention this. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that neither supports nor opposes political candidates or parties. The League of Women Voters values civil discourse as a means to understand others' viewpoints, clarify personal positions, and allow individuals to advocate for issues they care about. And just a reminder that we invite you to ask questions tonight. Please write your questions on the index cards that you'll find at your table. Some people have already brought them up. Bring them up to the head table, give them to me or to Mike or Elizabeth, and we will provide them to Anne. Also, I want to mention that at the close of the discussion tonight, we have a couple of door prizes to give away. So when our panel finishes, don't rush off. You might win a door prize. So now I'm going to start our program tonight by repeating the quote from FDR that I read you before dinner. Democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choices are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy, therefore, is education. Tonight's panel discussion is all about educating ourselves and others about misinformation and disinformation and its impact on elections. Then using this knowledge to help voters identify and understand what is the true and accurate situation so they can be fully informed when they vote. This is such a timely topic that I heard two relevant stories on WOSU Public Radio this morning. The first story was about a campaign ad that Bernie Moreno is running against Sherrod Brown. The gist of the story was about how PolitiFact, that's an important thing to remember, by the Poynter Institute, researches and then provides an analysis of the truth and accuracy of political ads. Please check out PolitiFact as a good nonpartisan tool for fact-checking. The second story was about how rumors and evidence generation can be used to push a narrative. In this case, the rumor was that Ohio has widespread voting by non-citizens. In spite of Ohio's excellent record of almost non-existent voter fraud, the false rumors about non-citizen voting have been used to undermine trust in the electoral process and to add restrictions on voting. I will leave it to the moderator and the panelists whether they wish to comment further on either of today's stories. And there are other stories today, too. But indeed, the impact of misinformation and disinformation on elections is so relevant and so timely. I hope I've raised your expectations and got you excited about this panel. I know we will learn a lot tonight and that you'll have lots of questions for our panelists. And remember to write your questions on the index cards. Now it is my pleasure to invite our moderator and our panelists to come to the stage. We are pleased to welcome back Ann Fisher as the moderator of tonight's panel discussion. Ann will be introducing the rest of the panelists. Ann Fisher has worked nearly 40 years in journalism, including nearly a decade covering state government and politics at the Ohio State House. She is the retired executive producer and host of All Sides with Ann Fisher at WOSU Public Media. She's also a friend of the League of Women Voters, having moderated or hosted several significant events for the League over the past several years. So welcome, Ann, and the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Did you want to move this? So you all can see us over there, right? Thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's timely. It's always timely. It's been timely for quite a while now, right? Talking about disinformation, misinformation, it's not new. But we're talking about that tonight and the dual challenges of disinformation and misinformation, because they're two pretty distinct concepts, and the impact of them on American elections, candidates, and the electoral process. So the English language reveals that made-up facts and those who would pretend to embrace, and I mean pretend to embrace those made-up facts to hide their real motive, have always been with us. It's nothing new. One source I consulted referred to these people as dissimulators, which is a kind of a cool word. Synonyms, though, for that word include hypocrites, phonies, and pretenders. I looked that up, too. Nothing new, really, except the internet and 24/7 news cycles, or, why don't we just throw in artificial intelligence just to really mess with us. So between those challenges and the pretenders, we face a monumental challenge in our society, and in a society that sort of fancies itself a democratic republic, dependent, absolutely dependent on citizen engagement, voter education, and oversight, and one that holds dear at the same time the free expression of ideas. We're going to talk about the history of misinformation and disinformation in particular, how it works, and how everyday Americans, in conclusion, I hope, can counter the challenges therein. So joining me tonight is Dr. Kelly Garrett. He's professor and director of the School of Communication at Ohio State. Welcome. Also, Dr. Eddith Dashiell, professor and director of the Scripps, my typo, E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. Welcome. And Dr. Anthony Wilson, he's Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Columbus Metropolitan Libraries. Welcome. So let's just start out with a little bit of a primer. Kelly Garrett, on some definitions. Misinformation and disinformation, two very different concepts. I've gotten things wrong a few times in my 40-year career, and I make corrections. I don't do it on purpose. That's kind of a form of misinformation, right? Can you illuminate us there?
Sure, I'll say a few things. The first thing I would say is misinformation has a wide variety of sources. We often think of it as intentionally deceptive. I would actually reserve the intentional stuff for disinformation. Misinformation, this is when you get it wrong because maybe you just misremembered, because a journalist makes a mistake providing coverage. Misinformation can also take the form of things that are intentionally not harmful but misleading. Think of political satire. We don't normally call the New Yorker a source of misinformation, but in truth, it can be a source of misperceptions. If someone looks at a piece of satire and comes away thinking that's true, they've been deceived. Many Americans fall for misinformation because they are simply interpreting incorrectly. They are looking at something that was shared and they're taking it out of context. Claims can, I think I see a lot of nodding, so I think you all understand what I'm getting at, right? Misinformation refers to, in the way I would frame it is, it's when the claim is not consistent with the best available evidence. For me, the advantage of that phrase is that it avoids truth with a capital T, because that kind of truth can be very hard to find. We don't always know what's true. Consider the origin of COVID. It's still being debated years on. And so to say simply, we know, here's the fact about the origin of it, would be an oversimplification. But we can say, based on the best available evidence, this is what experts are saying. This is what we think is likely to be the truth.
Right. So, Dr. Dashiell, we sort of bend over backwards in the news business and the journalism business of couching things properly. Allegedly thought to be, everything's sort of couched. Does that even matter anymore?
Well, I think it should.
I do too.
I think what's happened is because our society is so different with new technology, and people have blurred the definition of what news media are. When we think of news media, when I think of news media, I think of the traditional news organizations, the professional newspapers, the professional television stations, and the radio stations. But I think today, anything someone sees on social media or hears, regardless of who the source is, they collapse all of those sources under the umbrella of news media. I know when I'm teaching first-year students, because they've grown up with the computers, they've grown up with the cell phone. And so when I ask them where they get their news, their definition of news is different. Oh, I follow my Aunt Jenny's, Facebook page, or I follow my favorite musical group's site, or I get posts. And if I ask them anything that requires more than 7 seconds to read, they're not interested. And so I think I got off topic, but basically, misinformation is when you make a mistake. It's not malicious. And when you find out the mistake, professional journalists try to correct it. And so using allegedly, I still think is important. Making sure that the audience knows who your sources are, where you got the information. You just didn't make it up off the top of your head. And that's what disinformation is, just making something up, because now anybody can have that same access to the same technology. They can create their own videos. They can write their own stories, and they can make them look like what some of us would think of as traditional news media. And so from my point of view, it's the one question I hate getting is, what can journalists do to curb disinformation? The journalists are already doing it. It's what can those people who are not trained journalists do to dispel disinformation?
How, Dr. Wilson, how is that manifest at libraries? I mean, I used to fantasize about having a hotline to the reference desk at the library back in the olden days. You know how the president can just pick it up and he's talking to Putin or something? That's what I wanted. Now we have Google, we have all kinds of stuff online. So do you see a change where you sit as far as what people are asking about when it comes to clarification on facts?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we have seen a uptick in people trying to fact check and find out what's true and what's not, even to the point where we have some of our librarians are doing online courses about online searches, and in particular fact checking. So we have realized that with so much information out there that we're trying to utilize, right? Because we want to be up to speed on all the latest technology and have all the latest search engines and make things available to people, but we also recognize the fact that there's a lot of misinformation out there and some disinformation out there. And so we want to make sure that we're giving people the tools they need to fact check and to make sure that they're getting the sources, getting their information from a reliable source.
Well, there's always been a sort of a comfort level, though, picking up the phone and talking to a human being, and it's the librarian, and there's something about that when they're telling me, well, no, this is what happened. You don't really get that anymore.
Actually, in our library system, you still get that. I mean, you will still get a person that will answer your questions. And they will direct you to the sources that you need to help you make the right decision and the right choices for you and your family.
I always want to stop at a time like this and say you're listening too, but I just have to stop that. It's the weirdest little tick. Okay, what about propaganda? So in our society, I mentioned at the introduction that we also have this dedication and this reverence for free expression. Anybody can kind of say anything but fire in a crowded theater sort of a thing. Dr. Garrett or Dr. Dashiell?
Well, like everything else, propaganda has been around forever.
Right.
And United States government has had its own PR message it wanted to get out during World War I, during World War II. I mean, propaganda's been around a long time. The problem is to me, it's more narrow. I don't consider social media, where we're getting most of our information, I don't consider it mass media, where the message is sent out and millions of people get the same message at the same time. You put something on social media and it trickles through a narrow group of people who agree with what's going on. And so from a trained journalist, I think it's just to recognize when it's propaganda and to this is this source's viewpoint, to be able to recognize what it is, because it just seems to be more prevalent because we are faced with it more often because it comes out faster on social media. But it's not anything new to sharing information.
But as far as the consumers of it go, do they necessarily see it for what it is?
No, I don't think so.
Right.
So I wanted to back up for a moment and take a sort of definitional approach. Since I was talking about the definition of mis and disinformation, one way that propaganda is different is that it is not necessarily trying to make a factual claim. And so these are not entirely overlapping categories. Propaganda has an objective. You're trying to move someone to adopt a new attitude, as opposed to disinformation, where you're trying to convince someone to hold a new belief. Now, propaganda uses disinformation as a tool in some circumstances, but it also uses accurate information. You can sometimes use real facts to try and persuade someone that this is the right course to take.
And is it more effective now, given the delivery system we have of online, sitting in your room by yourself? It's not like you're reading the newspaper with your family over the counter in the morning.
So, okay, a couple of things. I think that the point that Dr. Dashiell was making about how when you get news from social media, you often, many young people, and not just young people, many people lose track of the fact that there is a source behind the source. When you ask people where they got their news, they often say, I get my news from Facebook. Forget about my aunt or NBC or NPR. They're all one thing. They all collapse. It's just Facebook or X or Reddit or whatever. I get my news from social media. So that creates some interesting complications. Also, there are really interesting tensions when we talk about mis and disinformation, because you have these high notes, like lots of Americans, lots of people here in Columbus, they want to know the truth. They're actively working to figure out, how can I do better at figuring out what's true and what's not? And when we look across the board, we see that Americans' accuracy on a whole host of issues has grown steadily more accurate over the last several decades. So it's easy to feel discouraged because there are a few issues where we are doing worse. But just remember how much effort is going in to moving the needle on those handful of issues, while a whole host of other issues people are becoming more accurate. That's one of these tensions that I want to get at. And then the other tension I want to get at, I accept what you're pointing out, is that social media changes the news ecosystem in some profound ways. And it can be pretty uncomfortable, and it's easy to point the blame at these social media companies because they're not always particularly well behaved. But one of the things that I've spent the last decade looking at is trying to document how people's use of social media is related to their ability to tell what is true from what is false. How does the frequency with which you use something like Facebook or X change your ability to recognize the truth? And I've looked at it a lot of different ways, and so far I haven't found any evidence of a relationship at all. People who use social media extensively are just as good or as bad as people who don't at telling the truth from falsehoods. Other things matter a lot more: education, ideology, partisan alignment, and so forth.
Let's talk about the phrase fake news and what at this point in time in 2016, for instance, was Donald Trump tapping into when he started to reiterate that phrase, repeatedly, fake news, fake news. It's not new. He didn't create that term, by the way. It's not his. He doesn't own that. But Dr. Wilson, what was he tapping into with that?
Well, I can talk from personal experience, maybe not necessarily the fake news piece, but there were some other things that were said, excuse me, during the 2016 campaign, and I was in law enforcement back then, for those of you who don't know, and there were a couple of phrases that kept coming up from a certain campaign about locking someone up. And so, right? And so me, being in law enforcement and trying to align my morals with the candidate of choice, I was conflicted. And I didn't do a really good job of searching the facts and ensuring that the news that I was hearing was either accurate or fake. And I almost took myself out of the electoral process, period. It was like, I'm not going to vote at all. And so the impact of those statements and even the fake news, it's disheartening for some people, especially if they can't find the factual information. So to answer your question, when people hear fake news, because there's so many different media outlets out there now, they can find one to support what that person was saying, and they take it as the gospel. And so I think it's challenging when you hear fake news. It's challenging for some people because it's just so many different sources out there to really try to find the truth unless you do a deep dive in searching. I don't know if I answered your question or not. But.
Yeah.
So I don't want to try and guess what Donald Trump meant or was trying to accomplish when he started using this phrase. But what I would say is that it's exactly the experience you described that makes me feel worried when we talk about misinformation. The notion that Americans are feeling like they can't tell what's true and what's not. They don't know which sources to believe, and therefore they're not going to try, therefore they're not going to vote. That is the biggest threat in my mind, because the number of people who believe these falsehoods, it's not... There are certainly too many people who believe a few really important falsehoods. But more worrisome to me is people who have given up hope in democracy, given up hope in our ability to make this system work.
And the last people I think that would be in that category, Dr. Dashiell, are your students, journalism students. And yet they, as we were talking about at the table, they come to you often just as ignorant, just as unschooled in those kind of, the process of gathering information as anybody.
True. I've been on a couple of these panels talking about misinformation and disinformation.
I think with me.
Yeah, we were, yeah. And so we go back, and I think one of it goes back to some of the students' definition of news. Mm-hmm. Some of them want to be in journalism, but they define even journalism differently. They're very narrow. I want to be in sports journalism. I want to do entertainment journalism. But I'm not hearing as many students they're there. We have them, thank goodness. But we don't have as many students as enthusiastic about covering politics or government. They want to do the glamorous things. They want to they want to interview the famous athletes. And so trying to get them to understand there's a whole world outside of sports.
Well, and then you've got the whole influencer thing. Right. That's going on too. I had a friend whose daughter is an influencer, and she was trying to tell me, well, this is a form of journalism. And I'm like,
no.
I didn't want to be,
No, and so, because many times we'll have parents who will call and say their son or daughter is interested in sports journalism. And what I have to explain, we don't have a sports journalism program. We teach journalism, and the same skill sets that you learn, you can cover sports, you can cover the environment, you can cover politics, and we offer. They have a lot of extracurricular, experiential learning opportunities to pick up the sports, but to have an isolated, separated something called a sports journalism major, we don't have, because it's all the same skill set. So getting students to understand that and not to limit themselves to what they think they want to do, because there are a lot of opportunities out there, and you want to be ready for whatever opportunity that's out there.
Yeah, and by the way, whoever thinks politics isn't glamorous.
Well, that's what we try to. I said, yeah.
And another thing is, a lot of, and Mike Kurt will back me up on this, a lot of former sports reporters are political reporters, and a lot of former political reporters are sports reporters. There's a lot of the same dynamic going on. So you make an excellent point that journalism's journalism. It doesn't matter.
So you have to use the same skill set. I have a former student who now is one of the, the fancy anchors of one of these Columbus television stations. And Matt started out wanting to do sports. And now he's early morning anchor here in Columbus.
Matt Barnes, yeah.
Yeah, Matt Barnes. And so when he comes back and he talks to the students. And of course, Dr. D, you didn't tell me Matt Barnes was coming to speak today. I go, well, you didn't read the syllabus. But anyway. But he talks about how the same enthusiasm, the same skill sets, the same fact-checking that he had to do when he covered sports, even when he goes to cover the Olympics, are the same set of skills when he needs to be, to cover news. And trying to get students to understand that, and trying to get them to understand the difference between the news media, who happen to use social media to share their message, and those other outlets that are just social media and they just share stuff.
Let's zero in on disinformation right now. The conscious effort to disinform people with an ulterior motive. What do we know, Dr. Garrett, about what the real impact? What are some examples? I can pull them out of my hat. Everyone knows about Pizzagate, those kinds of things. These are real things that people are acting on.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that identifying disinformation we can define easily, but distinguishing between disinformation and misinformation in practice is actually quite hard, because you have to know what someone's intent is. Proving slander versus just regular gossip is very hard, because you have to show what someone's intent is. Proving that someone is intending to deceive. Now, sometimes we have relatively compelling cases. Just recently, the Justice Department said, we've identified a network of Russian operatives who are funding Americans who are promoting a particular political party and a particular line. Now, the Russian operation is clearly a propaganda tool. It is arguably a tool intended to promote disinformation. But does that mean that the individuals who were being funded, who may very well sincerely believe the things they were saying, are they propagating disinformation? Is it misinformation? It gets very tricky to sort these things out. And so when I talk about the consequences of disinformation, I usually try and restrain myself to say, well, I'm going to call it misinformation because it's very hard for me to know. The consequences of misinformation, whether it's intentional or not, it's a very complicated story because in some cases, people believe things that just don't make that much difference in their life. Like whether you think the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun, probably not going to change your morning commute. But if you believe that that President Biden's election in 2020 was illegitimate, as fully 2/3 of Republicans in the U.S. today do, that is quite consequential. And does that come specifically from a disinformation campaign? I think there's some evidence that it does. It's not clear how much of that is based on things that are happening on social media. To my mind, the most consequential sources of falsehood are political elites. When a party leader or a former president makes a claim that is demonstrably false, is corrected, and doubles down, if you are a member of that party, it's actually pretty rational to say, this person whom I trust, who stands for the things I believe in, is telling me that this is the truth and others are lying about him. It's really hard to know what to do with that because historically, politicians have been responsive to the media, have been responsive to journalists, have been responsive to fact-checking. It's a very different world we live in when politicians get fact-checked and say, yeah, no, that's a lie. I'm telling the truth.
Well, and they've already sowed the seeds of fake news. You can't trust the media, the mainstream media, the whole thing. I mean, they've laid the groundwork for that, right?
Well, as you mentioned at dinner, distrust of journalists has been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. What people call fake news today was called yellow journalism in the 1800s. The names have changed, but the problem is not new. Embellishing, fabricating news in order to sell newspapers or get more people to watch, that isn't news. What has happened, though, is gotten to the point, again, my personal opinion, where people are believing certain things and it's really putting our democracy at risk. And trying to get people to see that and understand that, because I said this before, many times I feel like we're just preaching to the choir. I think I said that 2 years ago. We're all sitting here, and I think most of us are all saying things we all agree with, and we say, yes, we know the difference between disinformation and misinformation, and what can we do to curb it. But how do we get the message to those who are willing to think about it? That's where I'm stuck.
Yeah, none of it's new. And then, by the way, the whole foreign interference piece, that's not new either. I mean, the Nazis spent the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars back in the 30s and early 40s sowing the seeds among true believers, fascists in the United States, to get them to carry, the torch. Here, it's pretty well documented now. Yeah.
I just want to take up this question. Like, what do we do, right? It's very frustrating to know that so many people hold beliefs that aren't aligned with the best available evidence. And because, as you heard me say already, the thing that worries me is that people feel like they need to give up because there's nothing to do about it. I want to counter that narrative and say, again, we see that people do move. They don't move rapidly. Fact checks don't correct someone's beliefs. You don't see someone who says, I think the sky is purple. Oh, now I believe it's blue because you told me so. But you do see people move slowly on the spectrum. And so, as frustrating as it is, the fact that we individually get out there and say, no, the election was sound. Like, okay, in the state of Ohio, there has been a lot of investigation, a lot of searching for evidence of election fraud. We haven't found any. Those kinds of interventions, talking to the people you know, putting this kind of content on social media, they actually make a difference. I know it feels like you can't make a difference because we're talking about the entire population of the country. But if lots of people do it to the people, with people they know, it does add up. We do see motion. And again, I'm going to point to climate change because this, a decade ago, 15 years ago, seemed like one of the most intractable problems where beliefs had been coming, there was a lot of agreement in the late 90s, and then they diverged, the parties diverged, and it seemed like we were just going in the wrong direction and we weren't ever going to get back. Well, they've started to converge again. Americans are becoming more accurate in their perceptions about the human role in promoting climate change. This is important, and it's an example of how change does happen.
Yeah, Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, I just wanted to read something real quick and just want the audience to really think about this. So the American Psychological Association did research on how and why misinformation and disinformation is spread. And one thing that stood out from that research was that the algorithms that track user engagement to prioritize what is shown tend to favor content that spurs negative emotions like anger and outrage. Overall, most online disinformation originates from a small minority of super spreaders, but social media amplifies their reach and influence. And I want you to think about that when we think about that emotional piece and the fear that's being spread throughout in some of the campaigns, and we really can see why some of the campaigns are taking that approach, because it is, getting to people from an emotional standpoint, and they're fearful of losing something. And so understanding that, I think, helps us really understand why a certain approach is taking in political campaigns.
The claims that COVID was a hoax, you must have gotten a few phone calls at the library about that at the time, right? Yes. And we were all learning at the same time. So how did you manage that at Columbus Metropolitan Libraries?
I think sometimes what you have to do is, it's like proving it's not a hoax, right? As
the negative, yeah.
And I think that's, we approached it from the library as if, it was real. We felt it was real. And we listened to the professionals, the people that work in that area. We listened to the CDC. We listened to all those other organizations for guidance. And a lot of the information that we provided to our staff was really from the CDC and other professionals in that area, as opposed to trying to rely on someone who's not a specialist in the medical field. And I think that is a carryover to our customers as well. The fact that we approached it from listening to the professionals in that area.
As far as where people get the news from and what they read and what they hear, let's just refer to it as mainstream media for now. Dr. Dashiell, one of the things that we didn't do a good job, that I don't feel like I was taught or worked on when I was in J school and journalism school, was these touchstones in communities. We were really geared toward going to the local officials all the time and missing the guy on the corner, missing the guy at the drugstore, missing the guy in the barbershop, missing all those what we call community touchstones. Does that make a difference now, or is the big touchstone now just the internet, just social media?
Well, we know the number of newspapers is shrinking. We know that the number of newspapers that still exist are not owned by a family anymore or someone local. They're owned by a conglomerate or a media organization that may be based on the other side of the country. They just bought up your local newspaper. And so trying to bolster local news, to try to find a way to bolster that, I think it's key in a democracy, and also think that will help dispel some of the disinformation and help educate the general citizenry on how to steps they can take to fact check on their own. So we really need to help bolster local coverage, because there are a lot of things that are going on that it's like that. Does the sun revolve around the earth? Or, in the grand scheme of things, is it going to put gas in my car? Am I going to pay more taxes? So to find ways so these issues hit home, and that way they pay more attention.
Just two thoughts to add on to that. One, the decline of local newspapers is being exploited by some bad actors who are now starting to create these artificial, they claim to be news organizations. They sometimes buy up old names, but then they're filled with AI-generated nonsense and then periodically spiked with misinformation. And in that case, I think we can safely call that disinformation. So that's one thing that I think is a troubling development and could become more consequential as these networks grow. The other point I wanted to make about this notion of seeking the input of everyday Americans by turning to social media, right? I certainly understand the appeal. As a journalist, you're on a time, you've got a clock you got to work against, and it's always hard to do that. And reaching out to everyday Americans can be really time-consuming. But trusting social media as your source of what people think is a terrible idea. We've seen it over and over again, and the most recent example is, oh, look, the Russians are actually paying people. Like, why would you believe the things that you see on social media actually represent a normal human American person? Like, sometimes they're even AI these days.
Yeah. Dr. Wilson?
I don't think I have.
You look like a bobblehead over there. That's what.
No, I was just thinking about, we're talking about social media, and I keep thinking about the young people, the new people that are registering to vote, and how they're relying on social media and YouTube and all these influencers to get that information. And I had a conversation with a young high school student who shared some information with me that was not accurate, right? And I said, where did you get that from? And it's this social media influencer on YouTube. And that's what really frightens me about these future elections is the influencers out there, and how do we get our younger people to fact check to make sure that they're just not buying into what's being said by an influencer on the internet?
It's exhausting.
So, yeah, I try not to throw young people under the bus too much, right? Like, they rely on social media, that's true. But the empirical evidence suggests that misinformation online is spread primarily by older adults. Yeah. And
It's gobbled up mostly by younger adults.
no.
Okay.
I mean, we're still working on getting the data to understand this more fully, but it's really not the young people who are contributing to this spread. Now, it could just be because young people are generally not attentive to politics, right? I mean, Americans in general are not attentive to politics, but when you look at the spectrum, young people are among the least attentive. So that may be simply a byproduct of their lack of attention to politics. They aren't sharing it. The other thing that I think is affecting all generations, social media has created a sense, one of my colleagues described it this way, news finds me. I don't need to go looking for the news. I don't need to read the newspaper. If it's important, it's going to make its way into my world. And on the one hand, you can be a little skeptical and a little pessimistic and a little cynical, like, yeah, really? On the other hand, people that I've known my whole life who really have never been very interested in politics, in the last decade have started to be sharing political trivia with me. And I'm like, wait, what? Why do you know that? And like, oh, it showed up in Facebook or whatever. I'm like, oh, okay, so yes, it's changing. Yes, it's a little scary. Yes, there are some things that are bad, but it's not like our fate is written. We can still steer this ship, albeit slowly.
Okay, so There's mistrust of the media. We talked about that. It's not new. And then there's mistrust of the entire electoral process. And something I grew up believing, and I think probably everybody in this room, is we have the greatest process for elections in the world. I mean, didn't we grow up with people from the United States traveling to other countries to monitor and watch the electoral process? I mean, weren't we proud of that? Didn't we kind of wear it on our sleeve a little bit, a little superiority there? We've come tumbling down now. We've gotten a lesson in how fragile it all is. You know, Dr. Dashiell?
Sound like propaganda to me. You hear that, the U.S. is the best. And maybe we are in some things, but obviously in the last year or so, we have a lot to learn. And I think we got a little complacent and too comfortable. I tell the students first day of class, First Amendment. It's only 45 words on a sheet of faded parchment. It doesn't mean anything unless the majority of Americans are willing to support that right. And that applies to everything in the Constitution. And so the democracy is only as strong as we're willing to support it. And that means sacrifices on our part. So that means having to put up with speech we disagree with. It also means having to put up with some disinformation that's floating out there, but having the skill sets to recognize it for what it is and not let it influence us negatively when we go to vote.
Okay, so, but right now we're also in the midst of this anti-DEI, they don't want people teaching kids in schools about these things. Dr. Wilson, the skill sets, absolutely. But how do you teach those skills if you can't talk about so many things?
I think we're still trying to work through that.
Yeah.
I
feel like I got a lot of plates in the air right now.
Yeah, I think, so if I could talk about DEI just real quick. DEI today is not what DEI was meant to be. DEI was really just meant to be a lens in which we see things, right? We had to figure out who's at the table and who should be at the table, right? Who's in the workplace and who's not in the workplace and who should be in the workplace. And so it was a lens. It was never meant to be this separate thing, which opened it up to the attack that is experiencing right now. And so we've got to go back to, all of us up here have a different lens in which we see things. And so if we're all at the table and we put our minds and heads together and thoughts together, we can be pretty creative. And that's what DEI was meant to be. And so I think the approach to DEI now is to really get the truth out there about what DEI is and what it should be. Because when people look at it from that perspective, it's really not easy to attack it. Because you're just bringing everybody to the table that needs to be at the table to help make a decision. So I think it's important for us to stand up when you see or hear or learn of something that is disinformation. We have an obligation and a duty to stand up and at least fact check it for ourselves and put the truth out there. I think that's how we start to turn the tide.
You brought this, I think it's on the tables. You should have some on the tables, how to spot fake news.
Yes.
And when I looked at it, it reminded me of a talk I gave a couple years ago, and it was at a independent living facility, and there were a lot of people out there in the audience, and I don't think any of them were under 70 years old, and they were saying, yes, but how do you know? I mean, these are 70-plus-year-old people saying, how do you tell what's fake news? And I said, well, I did my best. I said, well, does it have a byline on it? Can you contact the byline person? Can you identify who the organization is and who's behind it all? And then again, I think I said, call your library, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think, that document that you have on your table.
Institutions.
Right, the International Federation of Library Associations and Organizations.
Institutions.
Right. Yeah. And so think about that. International Federation of Libraries put that out. So, it's so important for us as a library system to really help inform people on how to spot fake news and some of the steps that they can take to keep themselves safe. Because when you really think about, fake news, sometimes we just think about it from a political standpoint, but there are people out there that generate fake news to create harm. For example, I think some of you may have seen where 2 people were arrested. 2 white supremacists was arrested yesterday for disseminating or disinformation, putting disinformation on social media to cause a race war, right? And so if you haven't seen that, I fact-checked it. It's true, as far as I know. But people use this information to try to create harm as well. And so we really want to try to protect ourselves from being victims of that. And I think that document really helps to sort of start that process.
And Dr. Garrett, just about the idea that a human being has actually written it, AI has been mentioned now a couple times, but that's a real deal thing. It's nonsense sometimes, but other times it doesn't read like nonsense.
Yeah, so
It's getting better every day.
AI has been used to generate new content that looks like something that a human might produce. This includes conversational content, so you can be interacting with this machine in real time and have it seem as though it were a human being. It's producing images that look like photographic evidence. It's producing text that looks like something a reporter might have generated. So yes, it could be used to be deceptive. But the same strategies that we already use to recognize and guard ourselves against other kinds of misinformation can be used when we're dealing with AI. I mean, let's talk about some of the things we've already touched on tonight. Recognize when a claim makes you angry, makes you feel like you have to jump up and do something right now. We know this is a strategy that the people who are trying to promote disinformation employ. So you should do the opposite. If it seems too good to be true, stop and ask yourself, wait, am I sure it's true? Stopping and taking time helps. Next, what do? How do you stop and make sure? Well, read broadly. Don't just take, sometimes when you go to undergraduates and say, how do you tell if a story is true or not? They say, well, you read it really carefully. Maybe you look for the byline, you look for the source, you focus on the one story. Okay, that's not bad, but you know what's even better? Read broadly. Go find a bunch of different sources that are reputable and have a variety of different political viewpoints and see if they all say the same thing. If you can't find that really egregious image anywhere, you should be suspicious of it. If you can't find that claim, that quote, that headline, anything, if it's missing, you should be concerned. If you see the same basic story, albeit told from different lens with different interpretations, that's a sign that maybe you've got something going on here. You can use tricks like reverse image sources. You can take the picture and say, where's this picture been used before? And sometimes you'll find that it hasn't. Maybe it's AI. Sometimes you'll find that it's been used before and it's being reported in a totally different context. Here, this picture is from 2018 and someone's telling me it's from 2024. I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah. Well, Dr. Dashiell, I mean, when you're talking to journalism students, then do you, at a certain level, do you start first, teach them how to be good consumers of information themselves first?
We cover that in the intro class, and we also have a separate course in information literacy, where we teach things. Another suggestion would be, how high was this article up? If you did a Google search, usually the first page is nothing but articles that are sponsored. And so you might have to go to the second or third page before you find something that's more, doesn't have a biased intent to it. Because the sponsored ones, I've learned from experience not to click anything on that upper right-hand corner on Facebook, because it has sponsored in there, and it'll tell you, they call it clickbait. They'll tell you anything to get you to click. And then that's the way to, then you start getting algorithms kicking in, and you start getting all these articles for stuff. Being savvy that way. There's been a couple of times I've had to bring my mother down.
Is there any policy that could help curtail disinformation without infringing on the First Amendment? Dr. Dashiell?
Well, if policy is synonymous with law, no. I wouldn't want the government to pass any kind of law to try to control any type of speech, because that law could be twisted and misinterpreted, and it could silence me. And that, I mean, cause it depends on who's the administration is, who's backing it, and I just find it dangerous in a democracy to pass any type of federal law that says you can't say this, or you will go to jail if you say this.
So two things. The question of whether it's an attribute of democracy, I would point out that using rumors to achieve political ends, we can trace it back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece. This is not new. So I'm not going to put it on democracy as much as people just do this, right? And then on the policy side, one thing I would encourage you to reflect on, I agree, by the way, is that social media companies have more power as a media conglomerate than any organizations have had in a very long time over our information environment. And so while the government is not likely to pass new laws curtailing speech, I don't think, there is a lot of unregulated decision-making going around about how speech is promoted or constrained. Witness, for example, how Facebook has changed over the last few years. If any of you have noticed, your news feeds probably have a lot less politics, a lot less news than they did just 2 years ago. If any of you are still on X, you may have noticed that the composition of the content that is being shared and promoted has changed in some pretty dramatic ways. And this has nothing to do with the law. It has to do with some very powerful individuals who get to make rules about how algorithms that are opaque, not visible to us, that control how speech is shared.
No.
Okay. A question about the media. Do traditional journalists resist platforms such as YouTube and TikTok? And if so, why? Because isn't that where at least some people are? Why not meet them there?
I don't think news media in general are avoiding TikTok or Instagram. But if you are expected to share complex material in a TikTok video, it ain't gonna happen. And you're competing with a lot of TikTok videos that are made for fun. They're made to be satirical. Some of them are just flat out mean and and so when you have traditional news media content being mixed up with the mean, satirical TikTok videos, it's hard to compete at that level. If you go to any traditional news media site, they have a Twitter an X handle, they have an Instagram handle, they have a TikTok handle, but it's just how do you convey political content that we need, not what consumers want, but what we need in 7 seconds. That's the challenge.
Okay, another one on media. Local and state house media has long been a vital source of civic information and seemed to be more important than ever as a source of something against inoculation against disinformation. What's the best way we as regular people can help to support and amplify their work?
Well,
read it.
Read it and subscribe to the local. If you have a locally owned independent newspaper, buy a subscription. Buy subscriptions for Christmas presents or gifts or birthday presents. Get more people because, local papers that are not owned by the big media organizations, I mean, they have to be able to survive. And so that's one way to do it.
And there's a whole new category. I shouldn't say it's new. It's been around for a while, but independent, nonprofit news organizations
Exactly.
are out there. I mean, one of my favorites is in Michigan, and Bridge. And there's a lot more of them all across the country growing up that we need to understand, but they don't, if you're not looking for them, it's hard to find them if you don't know that they're out there.
And tying back to this question about social media and journalists' presence online, one good way to make good use of the established news media is to use it as a source of a fact check when you see someone post something false. Empirical evidence suggests that just telling someone they're stupid isn't very effective. You are much better saying, that's not what I heard. Here's a story that provides that provides evidence that actually these are the facts. You're probably not going to convince the person who shared the story, but what we know is that the sharing of that story, that falsehood, drops radically, dramatically, quickly, and the engagement that it gets afterwards is almost, it goes from these things are flying up and gaining lots and lots of attention. One fact check, you'll see it plummet. So that's a great way to both promote your paper by sharing the content from it and also to counter the harms produced by this disinformation or misinformation.
Here's a question, again, about the media that really echoes a conversation I had over the weekend that we talked about at the table with someone who said, why doesn't the media fact check? And this asks, can you comment on the mainstream media not meeting the moment we are in the U.S.? Is it the profit motive rather than a commitment to educating the public? Why will the mainstream media not commit to framing clear disinformation spewing from a candidate and the same candidate's sordid, even recent history of, quote, unacceptable, un-American violation of the presidential oath, along with numerous laws, end quote, behavior in truthful terms? Why will the mainstream media not rise to the moment and filter said candidates' utterances, nearly all lies, projection, and confession, blah, blah, through that truthful frame? Okay. I'll just say right here, I completely disagree that the mainstream media is not meeting the moment. I think you could open up the New York Times today, and I can't even tell you how many stories will say, will make it clear either in the headline or in the first paragraph, untruths, unvalidated, invalid, unsubstantiated, over and over and over again, if you read past, especially the headlines. But I don't know, Dr. Dashiell, what are your thoughts about that? Did I answer for you? I don't know. It was a long one.
Well, again, I feel uncomfortable when I have conversations with even some of my friends, and they say, well, it's the news media's fault. I don't think you can throw all the news media, all the journalists under one you can't generalize that way. Because I've seen news organizations that do try to fact check. What I think needs to happen is maybe if they could fact check faster. I mean, I saw someone comment, like for example, the debate tonight. They wanted the news media to be in a position to fact check during the debate while it's going on to challenge anything that would be considered untrue or misrepresented in real time. I don't know how quickly you can do that, but that's one way to do it. But I do think, I've seen more and more recently, because in the beginning, it was like generally speaking, news media were afraid to accuse someone of lying. They were afraid to say this was unsubstantiated. But I think in recent years, they've become bolder. Can they be more bold? Of course. But in some instances, I think it's an unfair characterization of everybody.
Did you want to add something?
I would note that journalists are in a particularly difficult situation. You were talking earlier about the need to provide qualifications, to be a little circumspect, to not claim overly bold, to be, you don't want to say, I know the absolute truth when you don't. People who are trafficking in misinformation aren't constrained in the same way. They don't have to pull their punches. They can make the boldest, most dramatic claim they want. And I think it's the right way for journalists to go, but it can be exploited. It can be used by political operators who are trying to undermine the very news that's working against them by taking advantage of the fact that journalists are intentionally careful, which is what we want them to be.
But I will add, you said something, there was the economic component to it. Profit?
Yes. Is it the profit motive?
I will agree there is a profit motive there, because a lot of the owners of the local media or national media, they don't have a journalism background. They weren't trained to be journalists. They were trained to make money. And I find that trend not only in the news industry, but in higher education, where it's more profit-driven. We're trying to make a profit. So they gear their advertising or their mission toward how can we make more money and what can be sacrificed. And sometimes laying off journalists is one way to cut down on the expenses and make a higher profit. So yeah, I think profit definitely plays a role in there. But you have hardworking journalists who are trying to do a good job in spite of that. That even though the owners want to make a profit, that doesn't mean that the journalists are catering to whichever way you want to lean for the sole purpose of making a profit. I think they're still committed to being careful and reflective and being balanced, the ones who are trained to do that.
There's a couple questions here regarding, contrasting mainstream media or traditional media and influencers. We brought up influencers early. One question is there a reason to trust corporate-run news outlets with paid advertisements versus an influencer, in quotations, who is relaying their experience and what? And then the other one says influencers are a fact of life and could be a force for good. How can traditional/legacy media and organizations help them? So let's talk about that influencer piece a little bit, because it's a big part of what particularly younger people are paying attention to.
I think one of the challenges that we have with influencers is that, I've said this several times about several different topics, they're vulnerable to be exploited. Right? So a news organization is not just an individual operating on their own, it's an institution. And it's an institution supported by an educational system built to reproduce the institution over time, and it's one that has laws set up around it to police its behaviors. And so, imperfect as it is, news is a known quantity. The idea that a single individual, by virtue of their charisma and the topics that they come up with, should be able to capture audiences of millions is at once exciting, and I can see the argument that these people are speaking their truth, they're speaking their experience. Yeah, maybe. I think a lot of them are. But how do you know when those influencers, maybe unwittingly, are being paid by the Russian government? Do you worry about the fact that influencers could be pawns in a larger game? Do you worry about the fact that influencers might not have any training in thinking about journalistic integrity? Does that matter? I think it does. And it's not because I don't like influencers. I'm not saying they shouldn't exist. I just mean that as a society, we have a lot to learn about how to make this an integral part of our media ecosystem.
How does a library system wrap its collective arms around the idea of influence, for instance? Let's skip the influencers. Content creators is what a lot of them refer to themselves as. And how do you catalog that content in this day and age?
I don't know that you can catalog it. I think it's just so many social media influencers out there that have carved out a niche for themselves because they make a profit too. And they've just carved out a niche for themselves. And I think the key is just providing people with the resources to be able to find the truth. Because every day there's a new social media influencer coming online, and they're carving out a niche. And I think, for some of them, there is a motive. They are trying to, sway someone's decision or to try to get someone riled up. And so, there's different things that you can do to search their background as well. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn looking at people's backgrounds. Like if they authored an article or something like that, I will go to LinkedIn and search them. And you can usually find out what their motive is or what they're into, what they like. You also can find out their background, which really helps too. So I'm not saying that's what the library does. I think we just have a plethora of information and resources out there that can help people really distinguish between what's true and what's not.
We are running out of time, and I wanted to just go through with you. We mentioned the How to Spot Fake News. This is an excellent document, and the League also has their own information sheet on the tables as well. It's guidelines to help individuals deal with misinformation and disinformation, and there's fact sheets on the table to help people understand what they can do. Do you have any additional advice, parting advice for everyday people? I mean, when someone comes up to me and says they want, back when I had the show, they wanted me to do a show on some conspiracy theory, and I'd say, well, send me your sources, send me some links, and of course I never heard from them again, right? But I wasn't doing it to be coy or to avoid it. If they'd had them, I'd want to see it. But they usually didn't, so that was my polite way of, and being polite about it too, by the way, right? I think you said something earlier, Kelly, about don't tell people, well, that's a lie. You don't know what you're talking about. Everybody, yeah.
I would just say I'm someone who had an affinity for politics for years and I almost thought I was going to go into politics. One of the biggest resources that I use, and it may not be necessarily, fact checking, but if you've ever experienced or went to allsides.com, I see some head shaking. You kind of see the right, the left, the center, and it really kind of helps you see how stories are being, or articles or stories are being put out there for the public to see, but it really helps you too to formulate your own decision on, what you feel is the truth or not, right? Because we all have, I may speak my truth, but it may not align with your truth, but it's still my truth, right? And so, but it does open up the opportunity for you to really help formulate your decision on what's true and what's not. It's called allsides.com.
No relation.
There are others also. There's one called Media Bias Fact Check, all one word, .com, I think.
PolitiFacts.
PolitiFact, yes, factcheck.org. And if you happen to use Microsoft's browser and you search for a news organization, the news organization will have a little scorecard next to it. That's produced by NewsGuard. NewsGuard is a very reputable organization. It will tell you things like what is its lean left, right, but also is it news or fabrication? Like what's its reputation?
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to remind people that we're dealing with the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, and they didn't share email drafts. CNN wasn't there to cover it. There were no social media posts. And so I think with the advent of new social media, we are really we're trying to figure out how to handle it as we go. And the technology advances a lot faster than law or policy or ethics can keep up, because the internet was not designed to be ethical. It wasn't so.
So my last comment would be, well, first, don't give up, right? That's the thing that I worry about most. And second, just listen to things we've talked about tonight. Like, there are a half dozen things that we've suggested that are really easy. Slow down, read widely, look at the sources and sort of thing. There are all kinds of strategies that you can use. And when you encounter things that you're not sure how to do, like there were some questions about AI. So you want to figure out how to spot AI? Well, you can Google, how do I spot AI? And there are quite a few stories from reputable sources that will tell you, if someone's growing hair out of their hat, you should be suspicious.
They're laughing because the AI generator will tell them how to spot AI.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you. I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Just give me 5 more minutes, and we'll wrap it up. I first of all want to thank our wonderful panel here. Thank you to Ann Fisher, Dr. Eddith Dashiell, Dr. Kelly Garrett, Dr. Anthony Wilson, and also to Mike Curtin. And also I want to thank the League of Women Voters Board of Trustees and our operations manager, Elizabeth Grieser. Elizabeth, raise your hand. Thank you, thank you. And to the membership committee who organized tonight's dinner meeting. I also want to add that I think that the League of Women Voters is always in a unique position because we are nonpartisan. That means we can talk to both sides and listen to both sides and have that window to keep influencing. The other message I like to keep repeating is to have hope. We can do this together, and that's what tonight was about. Now, and I also wanted to mention, we taped the entire evening. We will put the whole thing out on our league social media, and we will make some vignettes out of the most pertinent points and get those out there too, which you'll all be able to share. And in that, we will repeat some of the sites that you've been directed to for fact-checking. So, just one more thing tonight, and that is we have some door prizes. So, as our final act tonight, we have Columbus author Trudy Krischer. Trudy, raise your hand. She's donated some books tonight. Her new book is On the March, a novel of the Women's March on Washington. So she has donated some copies. And the first one I'm going to give to is who's our newest member. So I was guessing that we might actually have a member or two who signed up tonight. Is that the case? I know, I actually know the answer to this question. Thank you, Catherine. And our next criteria, I wanted to give a book to our 2 longest members of the League of Women Voters. So do we have anybody here who's been a member for 60 years? How about 55? I think it's you, Joan. 1957 is when she joined. Thank you, Joan. And I think the second longest member here tonight is Gloria. Gloria Davis? So, Gloria, how many years have you been a member? 53. Thank you. And I know we have a good number of other 50s, 40s, and 30-year members. So thank you to all of you and to our newest member. And again, I would like to thank the panel and to thank all of you for being here tonight. And I think this gives you plenty of time to rush home safely and watch the debate. Thank you all.